Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of Trials with Maya Z. It's Maya, as like you can recognize me by my voice. Probably you see me, and I'm very happy because it's Friday, but most of all because I'm actually speaking with Travis Caudill, who is the Vice President of Feasibility, Site Selection, and Medical Informatics at Icon. But I'm not that excited about the title, though. The title is wow, definitely. I'm excited because I know Travis for quite some time. And Travis is one of the few people in the industry that has spent like a lifetime working in feasibility with platforms, external platforms, building internal platforms, monitoring the space when it comes to data, insights, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, trying to support all sorts of teams at Icon and before that in other companies and has a fortune of know-how in the space. And of course, it was supernatural to invite him. Thank you so much, Travis. Welcome once again. And actually, before we dive into the conversation, please tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background.
No, I'd love to, Maya, and I'm excited to be chatting with you today. I have always enjoyed our conversations, and I'm super excited about the work you've been doing in the space at Find Me Cure, and just excited about where the industry is going. I actually started probably a little bit different than most. I worked for a health insurance company way back when. I was on the cutting edge of the technology. I was leading a project taking the claims database from a DOS-based framework to a Windows.NET framework, doing a data migration. And that sounds, really uninteresting today. But back in the day, data migration was one team with two computers, one with the old database on one, a
Wow.
new computer with the new database, and they were manually transcribing things. And we for a time had half our data in one system and half our data in another system. We're trying to match data up and serve it up to actuarial sciences. And, it gave me just a sense for how powerful data is, the sorts of analysis we
Mm.
were doing there. And I had an opportunity to make the jump into the industry to work for a regional CRO, Kindle at the time. It's now been
Oh,
gobbled up by INC, which then merged with Inventive to become Syneos. So a big journey there. But I had a chance to sort of come into this clinical research landscape, but with the perspective of how might we use real world data, claims data specifically, to drive our site selection activities in North America initially, and then it's a global world. So my interest quickly became looking at data across the spectrum, but at the heart of sort of my career has always been the patient data that we have and the patient journey. And so I'm really excited about the world we live in now, so many decades later at this point, where we have more data than ever before to drive decision making.
mm.
But with all of this data comes so much complexity and so much challenges that we have to sort of navigate. What's important, what's less important, how can we look at things in such a way that will allow those best decisions. So, I spend a lot of my time, and my team spend a lot of our time, really just trying to understand, this exciting landscape that we operate in, and to look for new and exciting ways to make sense of the world we're living in.
You actually started, Travis, with the fact that you said, I'm excited where the industry is going. And then you again like emphasize on how excited are you today around all the things that we're doing around data. I wonder why. What's the main reason now it's more exciting than before? Do we have more data or just the ways we can actually work on with data have evolved?
I, I think it's the access to data. I mean, even data in that DOS based system I mentioned at the start of my career, it existed, but it was very inaccessible. And
Mm.
I worked for a large insurance company, but it still wasn't a representative sample size of the entirety of the U.S. Patient population. Now we live in a time when you can get information on 315 million US lives. And we've seen just the digitization of information across the globe. I was recently working with a partner that is looking at EMR data in Africa, and they have 50 million African lives across
Oh,
6
wow.
countries. And I think that that's going to be incredibly helpful to a lot of our portfolios, especially in the infectious disease and vaccine space, but also potentially for biosimilars. Where we have a lot of challenges in the industry about how to fit this next wave of biosimilar research into the current geopolitical landscape. So I'm excited about the access to data. We have access to more data in more places, but I'm also excited about the tools that are being developed to help us interrogate and understand. Again, building queries in a DOS-based system, pulling out tables. We were printing things out on a dot matrix printer. You remember we had to rip the sides off the paper. This is now turned into a historical podcast. I feel like we're on the History Channel. Uh, but uh, but essentially, today we have AI driven tools that can help us look at data sets, that can read through natural language processing, can read notes, can
Yeah.
begin to add structure to those notes. And we're starting to look at how can we, use an AI to look across disparate data assets, that aren't related, and try to build combinations between them. Because in the world that we live in for a clinical trial, we own it. We owe it to our patients to try to get from concept to cure as quickly as we
True.
can. That's our
Yeah.
mission statement. For my
Yeah.
team at Icon, accelerating concept to cure. And so we have to make difficult choices about which geographies do we need to have involved in this clinical trial because they're going to be most compatible with the study. They're going to serve the most patients in those geographies. It's going to be like a valid care option, for those patients. And then we can enroll the study more quickly, which means we can get to an answer. And if the answer is this
Mm,
drug is amazing, that's awesome. I'm excited about that. But if the answer is this drug doesn't work, I'm also equally excited about that because now we can take the
true.
resources that we're going to go to that drug and put them to the next drug. And
Yeah.
I remember working on the development program for the first lupus drug approved in 50 years.
Oh,
And
wow.
and it was amazing that there were so many misses on the journey to a win, but that win was huge. It made a great impact in the lives of so many patients, and that success then spurred so many follow-on drugs that have been even better. So again, the wins and the misses, they're all part of the story.
Sure. You mentioned that data helps you. First of all, I'm listening to you and I'm like, it's so great that you as a person, as an expert, found your spot where you can have the biggest impact. Because when we speak like about data, clinical trials is all about data. And even within the clinical trial, you can also spend a huge amount of time, like of your career, only figuring out how to collect better data and so on and so forth. But then again, you decided to focus on optimizing clinical trials. It's very, I let's say my career pathway is more or less the same, and I understand that, but I want to understand why. Was it by, let's say, by a chance, or did you explicitly wanted to, well, did you explicitly want to start working towards optimizing clinical trials from the get-go?
When I started my career, I remember, I was working in site selection in North America, and we had targets for number of sites that felt, for different indications, completely unachievable. But because performance in the past had been poor, we were, going there. There may be 100 to 150 suitable clinical trial markets in the United States, as an example. Communities that are large enough to support a clinical site for most studies. But we would have studies where they wanted 200 or 300 U.S. sites, and I'm like, there's got to be a better way. Do we really need to have 5 sites within 10, 15 miles of each other? Is there a way to figure out the best location? Is there a way to increase efficiency, to make those targets more realistic? both for us to achieve, but because, again, we were investing a lot of resources and money, into a very, sort of inefficient schema. We're seeing today similar approaches to rare disease. We desperately
Mm,
want to accelerate rare disease studies, because these are unmet medical needs. But a lot of times we feel like the only tool in our toolkit is, I'm going to have 75 sites to enroll 50 patients so I can get 50 patients more quickly. But is that the best way? How do you
yeah.
keep your investigators motivated when a third of them won't get a patient? And that's if patients are, completely equitably distributed, and so is there a way to optimize to create a better experience for patients, a better experience for investigators, and again, to be more efficient with resources, so that we can do more research overall?
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. Because one of the reasons why a lot of clinical trials fail is obviously a lot of them like, get delayed, and that contributes to not many companies being even like it's not even possible for them to proceed. And budgets and high cost of clinical trials is one of the obstacles causing innovations not reaching the market, not science per se. That's actually what keeps me super mad about it. Not the science failing us, but actually operational obstacles and money, literally money.
Well,
I
and
have
then I
another
think if
question.
you
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think if you look at even one of the biggest large scale unmet medical needs that we still have today, dementia, Alzheimer's disease. Again,
Oh,
there have
yeah.
been some recent approvals, and it's excited to see some improvement for patients, some movement. So I want to applaud the efforts we've seen, but there's still so much more work to do here. But the
Yeah.
scale of having so many sites, adds a lot of complexity because now there are so many raters, and
Mm.
inter-rater variability is a huge issue for these studies. And so we try to drive centralized rating. We try to develop skills to do this, but still, I think that there's a place for data and being closer to the patients and trying to drive more volume of patients, to a smaller site population, that gives a lot of benefits, in the control and especially in that CNS space.
You mentioned, Travis, that you used to, like back in the days, I guess it's the same now as well, wonder which are these geographies that are the best fit for the clinical trials, for the patient population, so on and so forth. I wonder, is there, like, what is the type of data that has the biggest impact on making the right decision for which geographies?
It really, in my opinion, is a matter of compatibility. I'm going to borrow, from those cheesy, online dating apps, but it really is a function of how compatible is a particular country across a number
Hmm.
of facets to a clinical trial. So there have to be patients. We have to have an epidemiological component, but just having patients doesn't work because the protocol doesn't just require specific patients, but it often requires that these patients have either had or not had specific experiences or specific symptoms or specific treatments on their journey. So it really becomes a compatibility issue. Is the treatment experience these patients having at a country level compatible with the protocol? And is the protocol a compelling option? We in the United States, a lot of times there are patients. We see the patients clearly in EMR assets. We can see that they meet inclusion exclusion criteria. But when those patients are approached about the clinical study, they don't view it as an appealing, care option. And
Yeah.
so that perception of the patient about clinical research, which is often influenced by the relationship between the investigator and the patient, all of those things contribute to the success of a country. And certain countries have really strong relationships, between the investigator and the physician and the patients. They're high trust cultures where there's a lot of trust in the medical system, and we can see, significantly enhanced enrollment in some geographies, even geographies that have fewer total patients. So there's a lot to this. There's a cultural component. There's a standard of care component. There's a relational component between the investigator and the potential patients. All of these things play into the dynamics that contribute to enrollment throughput.
You actually summarized it earlier. You mentioned the patient journey, how important the patient
Mhm.
journey is, and to actually add to what you said, this interaction between the patient and the doctor is absolutely important for them to trust. Let's say the doctor, the investigator. But I would go even one step further. It's something that I heard from a patient advocate like recently. She said it's not just the doctor, it's the whole healthcare system. Do you trust the healthcare system? If you do, the likelihood of you trusting clinical research as well is pretty high. But if you don't trust the healthcare, why would you even consider research that sounds even more scary? So the whole
Mhm.
patient journey. I wonder what are the implications, Travis, if someone decides to skip this step and don't take into consideration the local patient journey and the local standard of care. What are the implications for the clinical trial?
Disappointing disappointing enrollment, right? Which then leads to, in the worst case, early termination of the trial for lack of enrollment. More often, it means adding more countries or more sites or both later in the study. And that's going to drive an extension to the timeline. It really is important to get it right and to get it right as early as possible, and to make sure that you're not just checking, you know, boxes in terms of, okay, epidemiology, check mark, done. But when we, for example, want to talk to investigators as partners, something that all of
Hmm.
us need to do as part of this process, it's equally important to us, not just that that investigator is experienced, but that that investigator is invested. Do they
Hmm.
see this as a valid treatment option? Is this something that they feel confident that would be a good option for their patients? And there's very few areas of research where there aren't options for the investigator to choose between one study with one compound or another study with another compound. And so it's good to have a discussion with the investigator. Well, what about this other development? Were you interested in that? Or, also making sure that you're having conversations about standard of care that is in flux or evolving. This is really something we see very frequently in oncology, where a single study can change a treatment paradigm rapidly by introducing or demonstrating the superiority of a new compound, or demonstrating that now monotherapy is as good as combination therapy in this line of patients with this particular biomarker. And so we have to, as we can anticipate that the standard of care is going to change, we have to be working those discussions in. And so I think having an environment where we can be aware as quickly as possible to those shifts, and then that we can have really high engagement and honest conversations about how we see the landscape evolving. That's really critical.
It is critical, Travis, but I'm just wondering from a practical standpoint, because correct me if I'm wrong, but usually these conversations happen, like the conversations with investigators, they happen rather later in the stage. Let's say very often you've already like planned the protocol, at least you have some sort of a final draft. And you may even have selected the countries already. And that's when you go to the local investigators to start getting their opinion. So how is it even possible? Because you mentioned we need to make sure that as early as possible, we take into consideration not only epidemiology, but also what's the journey of the patients and let's say the likelihood of investigators being excited. But how is it even possible before even speaking to them? And also, and to add to that another layer, sometimes I'm also struggling to understand the pragmatic side of things because speaking to an investigator is it takes time takes like efforts, it takes human interaction and so on and so forth. And I can't even imagine, you mentioned all the tools that we have. How does such an interaction even live in a tool with quantitative analysis, for example? Maybe I
Yeah,
asked
so
you like two
I
different
definitely
questions.
I definitely think it's a spectrum, right? So we engage with potential investigators multiple times on the journey from a
Mm,
protocol concept to a protocol being executed live to, the results and data coming in. So, I'd say that investigator outreach at scale doesn't come until that later time that you talked about. But I think that there's targeted outreach if you're doing
mm,
if you're embracing best processes or best practices. There's targeted outreach even in the protocol development landscape, and I think the majority of companies are recognizing the need not only to have KOL engagement but also to get
yeah,
feedback from other stakeholders across multiple geographies, and even getting feedback from patient advocacy groups and patients on protocols before they're finalized. So I do think we're getting better at that. But I also think that we have data and tools to look at how things happen. So when, say, there is a study, we've had many studies that have changed standard of care and a number of indications over time. We've been able to look at how, in the real world data, those changes to patient care have rolled across geographies. You tend to see, especially when new drugs are being developed, you tend to see adoption in North America and Western Europe first, and then adoption sort of rolls across other geographies over time. And so, we've now seen that happen so many times. So we have data models that can help us predict that, and we also have an increasing number of tools and data sets, that help us look at how things like reimbursement practices at a country are going to impact, these pieces. Because again, it's not just a matter of, okay, clinically we've proven that this is, superior. Well, that's great. But for this to become an option for patients, things have to end up on formularies. Things have to be
yeah,
approved either by payers, whether they be private payers or public payers. So understanding that process, and then understanding too the places where we see quicker adoption are places where, the burden financially is on a payer earlier in the cycle. In
yeah,
countries where, patients have to pay and then get reimbursed, for an expenditure, newer treatments tend to take root slower than where there's no upfront cost to patients. So all of these factors, all of these different data elements are kind of coming together, to drive how we're selecting that initial pool of countries, and then how we're slowly eliminating countries that we think are going to have, more issues or have less compatibility, if you will. So,
mm,
it's not one thing, it's not one sort of database. It's a lot of different data elements coming together, that are
yeah.
driving that.
So I guess that if I'm to summarize what you said, um, you need multiple elements to be brought together in a simplified way, so that then people can actually see that and make easier decisions by being able to see the whole landscape more holistically. Otherwise, they can skip that. Yeah, that's very interesting. So I see that you're
Exactly.
excited about. I see that you're excited about platforms. I am excited about that as well. But I wonder, you've been doing that for so many years now. What are the main obstacles of building platform like feasibility platforms, let's say, because that's your main domain? What are these main obstacles that you're fighting on a daily basis to make a platform be really beneficial for your teams and for the industry?
I think there are probably three things. Yeah, the first barrier or challenge or obstacle is complexity, right?
Complexity.
These are complex questions, so, there are there are excellent individual resources, for different questions, but there have not been a lot of great systems or tools historically that have been good at pulling a lot of expert resources together into a framework that allows decision making. Right. What makes me excited about today isn't necessarily that more data is available. I mean, it is, and I am excited about that. But what's more exciting are the tools we have to pull disparate data sets together to enable better
Mm,
decision making. So I think that's a challenge that we're seeing more systems and tools finally tackling. The second challenge I think here is that every protocol is different, and
oh, yes.
we've we've had a
uh,
mindset in the past that there's a way of doing things, right? So if
the
you want to
manufacturing mode.
run yeah, yeah. If you want to run a rheumatoid arthritis study, you need to go to Central Eastern Europe, and you need to have, you know, most of your sites in Poland, and that is the
Yeah.
blueprint when, there's actually a lot of opportunity for rheumatoid arthritis in Latin America and Asia Pac. And so, we were excluding compatible geographies just because no one had gone there before. And I think that
Mm,
experiential bias, I come across that all the time. I really do value the experience our project managers and project directors have had, but people will tell me, we can't run a clinical trial in this country because they had a bad experience. And I'm
yeah.
like, I'm at the same time saying, we've had the worst experiences in the world in the United States, and yet we somehow
You're so
figure out how to
right.
do clinical research here. We have the worst cases of fraud. We have had the worst
True.
issues of, more recently as an industry battling, like, we've made vaccine studies really easy for patients. So easy, in fact, that some patients are going to 3 or 4 sites, all doing the same vaccine study,
Oh, wow.
at multiple sites, and so, we've got to tackle that, so,
True.
again, we can't let individual experiences or biases challenge us. And then, kind of the third challenge I think that we've had, with respect to doing this sort of meta analysis, if you will, is that we have been rushed. Like it has, we haven't had the tools to do it quickly. And so, when that protocol concept is coming together and, we are starting to get focused on country and site strategy, we are needing to make these decisions in weeks, if not days,
Days
and so
sometimes, yeah.
you know it's we have to have we have to have the data, we have to have tools that can pull this expert data together, we have to have the flexibility to sort of reflect the nuance of each study and to not fall
Mm,
victim to our own sort of regimented thinking. And so we need to keep an open mind, and then we have to be able to move quickly. We can't spend
yeah.
weeks and weeks and weeks. And I know in my own journey that, when my teams were looking at just trying to pull together good site lists, they could almost get into data paralysis. There's too much to think about, too much data. It's hard to parse
Exactly.
out what's important, more important, what's less important. How can we make this decision? Because we need to have the site list ready, not today, but yesterday it needed to be ready so we can get on with getting our patients in. So, all these things are big challenges.
But isn't that exactly why the platforms are so necessary? Because we need to make decisions quickly. And at the same time, these decisions are very complicated. You have to consider so many variables, like so many variables. Um, and platforms are there for us to actually simplify some of these calculations, let's say, some of these analysis, so that it brings us, let's say, the most important things in front of our eyes, and it helps us to actually make decisions in a quickly manner, but also more accurately. Because even if you have more time, for the same type of decision, sometimes more time wouldn't solve it if you have to deal with complex ideas. And that's where we need exactly platforms. I would add, so if I'm to summarize, you mentioned three different obstacles, not obstacles, but like challenges for building platforms. The fact that that like we deal with like complexity of all sorts of data and interconnection between different data sources. You mentioned that the protocol, each and every protocol is different. And also this experiential bias. I fully agree with you here. Also that sometimes we're rushed and sometimes you have to do like these analysis very, very quickly. I would add to that, and I want to actually, I'm going to add like one more, and I want to hear your opinion on that, the user experience, because from my experience working on different data intelligence tools, it's very specific. How would you visualize and at what stage a certain data point? Because it can be the data, the origin of the data may be like the most accurate. But if you don't visualize it in a particular way that the user expects you to visualize it, it can also lead to confusions. So do
Well,
you agree with me? Yeah,
and I
this
think
is, yeah.
absolutely. I think that's what I meant when I said, data paralysis. Like if
Okay.
it isn't in a decision making framework to help enable the user to make
Mm,
the decision through what you've described are meaningful or actionable insights. Graphics that help point to trends that help you define points of strategy. If it's not doing those things, then the data actually causes you to make decisions slower or to feel like you can't make a decision,
yeah.
which is the
Yeah.
opposite direction. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think what's exciting about this time is that we now have technology and platforms that are responding to these challenges and working to
I
overcome them by
agree.
pulling disparate data sets together. And I think, there are going to be hits and misses, right? The complexity here means that, we're going to pull some things together and then experientially, we're going to figure out that this is less important than that. And sometimes this and that, the importance can be weighted relative to a particular opportunity. That goes back to that every protocol is different. Yeah, so having a platform
True.
where, for this study, we can wait on this. I'll use a great example. You know, I would genuinely say that experience is helpful. Having experience with a particular clinical trial is helpful. It means that the site has had experience looking for these patients, talking with these patients, bringing these patients into a study. But there's a point at which experience becomes unhelpful. Let's go back to rheumatoid arthritis that I mentioned a little bit earlier. We have had, over a decade of rheumatoid arthritis studies that are looking for patients to be completely naive to a class of medications that after they're exposed to any medication in that class ever, they're never naive again. And so a site
Mm,
that has done 10 of these studies is going to have a lot less future opportunity because all the patients, even though it's a chronic disease, all the patients that they might have been able to bring into this clinical trial have already been exposed. And so in countries, where the first countries for some of these studies were like the United States, and the initial studies, we saw enrollment rates that were fantastic 3, 4, 5 patients per site per month. If you run a rheumatoid arthritis study today looking for a biologic naive patient, point 2 to point 3, so
yeah.
one patient every, 3 to 5 months. And that's because, now all the patients that are sitting there have been exposed to that class of agents. And now you're just waiting on new diagnosis. And so we have to have a decision making paradigm that says this is when experience is good. And this is when a tipping point where experience becomes a liability. And again,
Yeah.
that's just one example across a number of factors where
But
the
it's a great
ability to
example.
flex, yeah, it's incumbent for us to have platforms that can, one, understand the value of experience and bring that component into the discussion alongside the patient pathway and alongside these other areas, but then understand that that's where experience and patient pathway and protocol collide, because the patient
Exactly.
pathway means you've now had this drug, which means you can never be in another naive protocol again, but about 4 or 5 years after those studies started coming, we then started to see, drugs for JAK inhibit, or we saw JAK inhibitors come on the market, and now those drugs were looking for failures. So now we're resetting the cycle. Now we're looking back, and so again, we've got to have a platform that pulls all of these pieces together, and allows us to make a decision kind of tailored to the protocol at hand, taking into account the patient pathway, the patient journey, how they're being treated, and taking into account all of these other factors like competition and experience as well.
Almost like a library that has all the important pieces of information, but allows you in a flexible way to treat these data details in a different way so that you can adapt to the protocol. Because you're absolutely right, every single clinical trial is so
A
different.
library is a library is a great way to look at it, but I am a nerd in almost every way imaginable, Maya. So I fancy myself Batman. I think everybody knows about
Yay!
Batman across the world, but he's got anything and everything on that belt, and so
Exactly.
I'm
I love
looking
that.
for the feasibility belt, the feasibility Batman belt, so
Nice.
that we have all the
Nice.
tools, platforms, and data we need to respond to whatever situation is going to pop up.
Okay, so I can see that the next conversation will be around the Batman belt because we want to get the secret sauce. Like, what do you need to have on the Batman belt? Actually, that's my last question. My last question is, where do you see the future of feasibility? And it may be to do with platforms, but actually, I'm genuinely interested, like overall, where do you see the future of feasibility? And with one amendment, when I say feasibility, I know that usually feasibility is perceived as site feasibility. Here, I'm speaking about the whole clinical trial planning process. So where do you see the
Yeah,
future of
let's
feasibility?
say let me answer from the perspective of study
Yeah.
optimization. How about that?
Yeah. Okay.
Feasibility as
Yes.
study optimization. So I think the future is continuing to penetrate so that we have the same data elements across more geographies. Right. I want to be able to
Hmm.
access patients no matter where they are, and that is so critical. Again, I mentioned how excited I was, having EMR data in Africa. I want to see more of that. I
Yeah.
want to see more countries, in the developing world having deeper data assets. I want us to have a more robust and AI supported ability to interrogate, everything. So as we're pulling everything across the Batman belt together, if you will, we have to remember that Batman was a genius. Like he was able to sort of figure everything out. I am not a genius, so I need help, and that's where I think kind of AI and the work that we have with machine learning and deep learning models can
Yeah.
help us, enhance the analysis we're doing with these tools to develop the right game plan. And so I'm looking to get more data. I'm looking to have more sophisticated analysis, of each of these data elements. And I'm excited about a model that not only allows us to optimize, this to pick the right country and site strategy, but also to do a better job predicting what it's going to look like. Because we're,
Yeah.
we're I think we're making headway as an industry. We've been bringing down, for example, our percentage of non-randomizing sites. So we're doing a really good job of trying to get to sites who have patients so that we aren't investing in sites that aren't putting patients into studies. Uh, but all of us, the investigator, the CRO, the sponsor, I've not met anyone who can accurately predict how many patients a site is going to put on. And so I think there's a lot of complexity and future state energy that needs to be put on building more advanced models. And I'm convinced we might need a quantum computer to do that. Again, super nerd here, so I think quantum computing is exciting, but I think just that ability not only to optimize but to develop better models to predict what's
Mm.
going to happen is going to be really, really exciting.
I'll go the extra mile because I'm not a nerd, but let's say around nerds. Like my team is like most of them like nerds, and I would say that I hope that we have a quantum computer that actually replicates a clinical trial without a human being. But that's like a really many steps ahead. But I love the Batman like belt definitely, and keep like doing what you're doing, Travis, because we need more efficient clinical trials. And I also believe that study optimization goes through more data, better data understanding, and all these require a better environment that really enhances people's experience, their skills and knowledge, so that they can make better assumptions and better decisions for how to run the clinical trial, and not only before they start, but even when they start, because it's not only the protocol that's different, specific, but even once you start the actual like working on the protocol, everything's so dynamic. So we need to be able to adapt, not only when we choose
Yeah.
countries and sites, but even when we work with these sites. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for all
And
these insights, Travis.
no, I've really enjoyed it. And I think at the end of the day, if we're successful in our endeavors, as we make even incremental progress, accelerating concept to cure, that means cures for our patients quicker. It means more research being done. It means lower cost to get research done, which can mean lower cost for patients, lower cost for governments and healthcare systems and payers. All of these things ultimately lead to better lives so we can enjoy more superhero movies together, and live
Yeah,
out our
I
Batman
like the super
fantasies. So
movies like together. Definitely. That's
thanks again,
super
Maya, for having me.
motivational.
I really
Thank you
appreciate
as
it.
well, Travis. Thanks.